Sandra, hi, this is Jerry Seinfeld. Listen, I just want to tell you there's been a terrible misunderstanding. See, I told Elaine that it was a real treat talking to you on the phone.
In 1991, something happened on the Seinfeld set that had never happened before. The entire cast walked off and refused to film. One actress read a single line about killing presidents and said, "We're not doing this." Sets were built, guest stars were hired, but the episode died that day. For 33 years, nobody knew what really happened until someone found the script online. Now we know why even the creators said it went too far. On a chilly night in November 1988, Jerry Seinfeld and Larry David weren't chasing a big TV deal. They just wanted a snack. They walked into a small Korean grocery store in Manhattan, fresh off their sets at the Catch a Rising Star comedy club. As they wandered the aisles, their usual riffing kicked in. Larry pointed to a jar of Korean jelly and asked, "Why jelly? Why not foam or spray?" They laughed at the odd items on the steam table. Who actually ate this stuff? Then Larry stopped. He looked at Jerry and said, This is what the show should be. Just this kind of conversation." Jerry didn't jump in excitement. He shrugged. It was a strange idea, a show about nothing. But Larry was serious. What if a sitcom wasn't about big events or cheesy lessons, but the little stuff people always overlook? What if everyday nonsense could be the comedy? NBC didn't ask for that. They'd offered Jerry a one-time 90-minute special, something to fill a Saturday night slot when SNL wasn't airing. They expected sketches, maybe stand-up, but when Jerry and Larry sat down to write it, they knew it wouldn't work. Their idea was too subtle for a loud variety show. So they did something risky. They tossed the 90-minute plan and wrote a 30-minute sitcom pilot instead. That script became the Seinfeld Chronicles. It focused on dry cleaners, laundry quirks, and shirt buttons. It was filmed on the same sound stage where the Dick Van Dyke Show was shot. Larry took that as a good sign, but Jerry wasn't fully sold yet. The next night, after a gig at the Improv, the two met again, this time at the Westway Diner. Larry pitched it differently. "Let's show how a comedian gets his material. That's the real show." That clicked for Jerry. It wasn't really about nothing. It was about the process. The late-night idea became a late-night TV revolution. Larry had another reason to chase this show. He was broke in 1988. He had no steady job, barely any money, and a reputation for walking out of writer rooms. He once gave a friend a handful of jokes as a birthday gift because he couldn't afford anything else. But those jokes made people laugh, and Seinfeld noticed. So when NBC called, Larry knew this could be his shot to finally make something real. He bent more than usual, accepted the studio notes, and worked around the clock. The man who once quit Saturday Night Live after just one sketch now had something to prove. The show's title was another mess. NBC didn't trust it. They tried calling it Stand-Up, The Seinfeld Chronicles, Good News, Bad News, Pilot, and even The Jerry Seinfeld Show. Nothing stuck until someone just said, "Let's keep it simple, Seinfeld." But that simple title hid how close the show came to collapsing before it started. Casting wasn't smooth either. The role of George Costanza was turned down by Chris Rock and Danny DeVito. Chris Rock later joked he would have been the black friend. Danny DeVito was too busy making movies like Twins. He didn't want a sidekick role. That left Jason Alexander, a theater actor in New York. He wasn't even in LA when they were casting. He got a few random pages of the script, and to him it read like a Woody Allen movie. So he did the only thing he could think of. He taped an over-the-top Woody Allen impression. Glasses, voice, everything. He figured they'd never call, but they did. They flew him out and said, "We love it, just tone the Woody down a bit." And just like that, George Costanza was born. Elaine wasn't even in the original pilot. NBC thought it was too male, so they told Jerry and Larry to add a woman. Auditions flooded in. Megan Mullally impressed Jerry. So did Patricia Heaton and Rosie O'Donnell. But then Julia Louis-Dreyfus walked in. Within 30 seconds, Jerry knew. "She cracks you up without breaking your nuts," he later said. Julia won 2 Emmys for that role. Jerry called her the sparkle of the show. Then came Kramer. That role was easy to cast but came with a twist. Michael Richards had worked with Larry before and was known for physical comedy like Really Physical. On a sketch show, he once demanded a bag of dirt to make a joke work. That's how far he went for a bit. On Seinfeld, they had to stock extra door hinges. His entrances broke them all the time. He'd wear pads under his clothes to avoid injuries. He'd practice alone, making strange sound effects with no script. He wasn't playing Kramer. He was Kramer. And then there's the real Kramer, Kenny Kramer. He was Larry David's neighbor. At first, he didn't want them to use his name unless he got to play the part himself. So in the pilot, Kramer was called Kessler. Eventually, they bought Kenny off for just $1,000. That was it. $1,000 for the rights to a name that would become iconic. When NBC executives first watched the pilot of Seinfeld in early 1989, their reaction was cold. Brandon Tartikoff, the president of NBC's entertainment division, didn't just pass on it, he insulted it. He said it was too New York, too Jewish, which was ironic because he was both. He wasn't alone either. The pilot aired to 24 top executives, and though a few chuckled, Tartikoff stayed stone-faced. He famously asked, "Who will want to see 4 Jews wandering around New York acting neurotic?" That comment nearly killed the show. But behind the scenes, 2 men, Warren Littlefield and Rick Ludwin, refused to let it die. They believed in the weird charm of the show, and they fought for it. Eventually, Tartikoff would change his tune completely, calling Seinfeld one of the most important shows of the 90s. He just didn't see it at the start. But the executives weren't the only ones who didn't get it. NBC went a step further and ran the pilot past a test audience of 400 households. The results? Brutal. They aired the episode over in used cable channels and then followed up with surveys. The feedback memo, which Littlefield kept at his desk like a scar, called the whole thing weak. Nobody wanted to watch it again. Viewers didn't like the supporting characters. They thought Jerry needed a better backup ensemble. People didn't even understand what Jerry did for a living. One note complained about the scenes in the laundromat. "You can't get too excited about going to the laundromat." They said that line hurt especially because that kind of boring everyday nonsense was the entire point. It was almost a death sentence. Littlefield remembered the memo as a dagger to the heart. But they didn't tell Jerry or Larry David about it, not until years later, when copies of the memo ended up framed in their bathrooms as trophies of how wrong everyone had been. Still, the network didn't believe. When the pilot finally aired on July 5, 1989, NBC didn't treat it like a launch. They buried it. It aired in what insiders called garbage dump theater, a quiet summer slot meant for dead pilots they just wanted to get rid of. The numbers weren't terrible. It pulled a Nielsen rating of October 9, 19. That meant 10.9% of American households tuned in, and 19% of TVs that were on were watching. But it didn't win its time slot. A CBS cop show beat it, and it tied with some hidden camera show on Fox. NBC didn't even include it in their official 1989 to 1990 schedule. Internally, it was already done. But again, Ludwin wasn't done fighting. He canceled a Bob Hope special and redirected the money. That move bought the show 4 more episodes just 4. It was the smallest order in sitcom history, but it was enough. The 4 episodes didn't even air until May 30, 1990. That meant there was an 11-month gap between the pilot and the next episode. During that time, Castle Rock, the studio behind the show, tried to sell it elsewhere. No one wanted it. NBC, with its tiny order, was the show's only lifeline. But when they re-aired the pilot exactly 1 year later, it did better, a lot better. It got a 13.9 rating and a 26% share. That was enough to greenlight season 2. That 1-year limbo almost killed Seinfeld, but it also gave it time to find its rhythm. From that fragile beginning, Seinfeld exploded into one of the most profitable shows in TV history. By the late 90s, it was making NBC $200 million per year. That's not revenue for the show, that's what NBC made after expenses. The show cost about $2 million per episode to produce, or around $50 million a season. But they were pulling in $550,000 for every 30-second ad. The math added up to one thing: Seinfeld was a gold mine. NBC even spent an extra $30 million just to keep the final season alive. They had never done that before. They've never needed to since. And then there was Jerry. In 1997, he did something no actor had ever done. He secured a $1 million per episode salary that made headlines around the world. He was earning about $13,000 per line. In the beginning, he was paid $20,000 per episode. Then $40,000. Then $100,000. By season 7 and 8, he made $500,000 per episode. By season 9, he reached $1 million. His total earnings from the show came to around $60 million, closer to $100 million when adjusted for inflation. That move set the stage for what came next. The cast of Friends followed suit, demanding and getting the same million-dollar payday. Courtney Cox later said Seinfeld's deal scared a lot of studios. But the biggest shock of all came when Jerry turned it down. In 1998, NBC offered him $5 million per episode to come back for season 10. That would have been more than $100 million for just 20 episodes. He said no. Warren Littlefield, the NBC exec who had backed him all along, was stunned. He said they made the offer with tremendous confidence that no one could refuse it. But Jerry did. He told them he didn't have a life anymore, no wife, no kids, just the show. It wasn't worth it. He walked away. He said he wanted to end Seinfeld from a point of strength, and he did. The final episode aired on May 14, 1998. It pulled in 76.3 million viewers. That made it the third most watched series finale in American history. That night, 67% of all TVs turned on in the US were tuned to Seinfeld. It was so big, other shows made jokes about it. Boy Scout meetings ended early so parents could get home to watch. People planned their evenings around it. The two-part finale brought back old characters and had the main four arrested for failing to stop a mugging, ending up in jail. That ending divided fans. Jerry later admitted it might have been a mistake, but he stood by it. He and Larry David even revisited the idea decades later in Curb Your Enthusiasm, calling the ending an arrow that landed in the sun. But Seinfeld wasn't just a hit. It changed how people talked. It gave the world new language: yada yada yada, close talker, regifting, double dipping. Before Seinfeld, nobody cared about dipping a chip twice. After it, it was practically a crime. Festivus became a real holiday. Colorado even made December 18th National Regifting Day. The show's quirky terms became shorthand for everyday life. In the pre-internet era, Seinfeld was how America made sense of itself. Someone once said, "Nowadays we have Wikipedia. Back then we had Seinfeld." And somehow, it all started with a pilot nobody believed in. But there was something happening behind the scenes. The Chinese restaurant episode that nearly got the series cancelled in season 2 represents one of television's most significant near misses in entertainment history. NBC hated it so much they delayed the episode, hoping it would quietly disappear. It had been filmed as the 6th episode of season 2 but didn't air until much later. They told Jerry and Larry David directly, "We don't understand this show, and we think it's wrong." But Larry refused to back down. His whole idea was to show what 5 to 10 minutes of waiting really felt like. The episode aired despite NBC's fear, and everything changed. Fans loved it. That strange little episode turned Seinfeld into something new. It proved that breaking the rules of TV could actually work. Then came another risk. This time, it was about masturbation. Larry David had been holding on to the idea for years but figured it would never get past the censors. The word, masturbation, was never even used. Instead, the characters used the phrase, "master of my domain." NBC shockingly said yes. Even though they later got 62 complaints, they let it air. Why? Because Larry threatened to quit if they didn't. The gamble paid off. The episode became one of the most iconic in television history. It even won a Primetime Emmy. Other shows like Big Mouth and It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia later copied it, but none of them ever matched the original shock and genius of that first airing. Larry David threatening to quit wasn't new. He did it often. At the end of every season he'd say, "That's it. It can't be done again." Jason Alexander remembers how this became a running joke on set, but it wasn't just drama. Larry was genuinely exhausted. Writing a 60-page script in 2 days, 8 months out of the year, was brutal. Jerry once said the work nearly killed them. Larry felt all the pressure. If the show failed, he believed it would be on him. Eventually, after season 7, he finally left. Jerry told him, "Then go." Without Larry, Jerry dropped the stand-up scenes. There just wasn't time to do it all anymore. Even the show's humor sparked controversy. Although Jerry was the only character openly identified as Jewish, the entire show had deep Jewish roots, from the way they argued to their expressions. That became a problem for some. In one episode, a nervous Mohel performed a circumcision. Another introduced a rabbi who made some viewers furious. Over 100 complaints were sent to the Anti-Defamation League. Critics called it tasteless, but others defended the show. Jerry's own sister said, "The cornerstone of Jewish survival has always been to find humor in life and ourselves." The show even flipped stereotypes. Jerry, who was Jewish, liked spending money. George, who wasn't, was the stingy one. George Costanza's clothes were a problem too, on purpose. Jason Alexander wore outfits one size too small. The goal was to make George look like a man barely holding himself together, and it worked. He always looked tense and uncomfortable. Ironically, Alexander was in good shape, but the tight clothes made him appear heavier. He still owns some of the outfits today, including 2 sport coats and the original sneakers from the show. He keeps George's glasses in a safe deposit box. Even Elaine's pregnancy was hidden using heavy clothes that didn't move. That was how carefully the wardrobe team planned every detail. But not everything made it to air. There was one line meant for George that NBC wouldn't touch. "I've never seen a black person order a salad." It was supposed to kick off an entire episode about race. NBC shut it down immediately. They were fine airing masturbation jokes but drew the line at this. They didn't think a show with no black cast members should make jokes about African American habits. That episode never even got written. It was a rare example of the network saying no, despite usually letting the Seinfeld team push the envelope. Even Kramer got blocked sometimes. One episode idea had him suing a bar over their ladies' night promotion, claiming gender discrimination. Writer Carol Leifer pitched it. She had written hits like The Rye. But Jerry and Larry rejected the story. It didn't fit their style. Leifer had another idea, Kramer volunteering for medical experiments. That one got shut down too. It was just too dark. The show often pushed boundaries, but even they had limits. Larry Charles, one of the show's darkest writers, was known for going too far too fast. He wrote episodes about Nazis, stalkers, and even a botched circumcision. He was inspired by noir films and old comedy. He gave Kramer his wild side and invented unseen characters like Bob Sacamano. But some of his ideas were just too much. NBC rejected several of his scripts, including one about guns and another with racial themes. Later, Charles took that edgy style to movies like Borat and The Dictator, where he had more freedom. By season 2, the cast had gained real power. They used it to shut down an episode called The Gun. Elaine was supposed to buy a handgun. Julia Louis-Dreyfus said, "We're not doing this." Jason Alexander hated a scene where Elaine joked about assassinating presidents. Michael Richards couldn't change their minds. The cast told the director, "This isn't happening." Sets had already been built. Actors had been hired. But the whole thing was scrapped. The show had never killed an episode that late in production. It became a defining moment of control for the cast and crew. That episode, The Bet, nearly aired in February 1991. It was supposed to be episode 4 of season 2. Everything was ready. Guest stars were cast. Scenes were rehearsed. Sets were built. But the December table read went horribly wrong. Elaine would have bought a gun after being mugged, becoming disturbingly obsessed with it. Julia Louis-Dreyfus refused to do it. Director Tom Chiron said, "You can't make a funny show about guns." The episode also would have revealed Kramer's first name as Conrad, a detail that later changed to Cosmo. But it got worse. Elaine had a line about choosing between a Kennedy or a McKinley, referring to two assassinated presidents. Jason Alexander said Julia gave him the most miserable look he'd ever seen after reading the line. The script crossed a line, especially since JFK references were common on the show, and the movie JFK had just come out. Even Kramer had a disturbing subplot, claiming he had sex with a flight attendant and making his friends track her down to prove it. That story turned a woman into an object and dragged the characters into a gross situation. Worse still, Elaine accidentally pulls her gun during the confrontation. Sexual humiliation and gun violence in one scene. It was a disaster. The cast's reaction was fast and unified. Julia was the first to say no. Jason backed her up. Michael Richards wasn't as disturbed, but he couldn't convince anyone. The whole cast stood up and walked away from the episode. Director Tom Chiron ran into NBC executive Glenn Pannick in the parking lot and broke the news. Pannick was relieved. Jerry later said, "We just couldn't solve the funny problem. It wasn't about taste. It was about balance. And this episode had none. Still, it's shocking how far it got." Guest stars Bobby Joe Lean and Ernie Sabella were already hired. Lean later played Patty in The Stranded. Sabella showed up as the naked guy in the subway. The gun shop set was fully built. The cancellation cost serious money. Even worse, Larry and Jerry had to come up with a brand new script, the phone message, in just 2 days. For a show with low ratings and a tight budget, that was a huge risk, but they made the right call. Years later, the lost script resurfaced online. A Reddit user found it and posted it in 2024. Larry Charles confirmed it was real, recognizing his own handwritten notes. Fans finally got to see how close Seinfeld came to crossing a line it could never return from. In a way, the bet wasn't just a cancelled episode. It started like any other absurd moment in Seinfeld. Kramer, desperate to use the bathroom, disguised himself as a rich industrialist H.E. Penny Packer just to sneak into a stranger's apartment. After crashing there with Jerry and George to watch the Mets game, he stepped outside right into the chaos of the Puerto Rican Day Parade. Someone handed him a sparkler. Innocent fun, right? But in typical Kramer fashion, it spiraled out of control. The sparkler touched a Puerto Rican flag. It caught fire. In a panic, Kramer tossed it on the ground and started stomping on it. That one moment, just a few seconds of slapstick, set off a national firestorm. The flag wasn't just cloth. It was a symbol. For millions of Puerto Ricans, it represented pride, culture, history, and struggle. Watching it burn on screen and then seeing a character stomp on it felt like a direct insult. The crowd in the show formed a mob, furious at what they thought was a deliberate act of disrespect. But the real fury came from viewers at home. The episode aired on May 7, 1998. It pulled in 38.8 million viewers. That made it the second most watched Seinfeld episode of all time. The massive audience only made the outrage louder. Then came the line that really ignited things. From the safety of the apartment, Kramer looked down at the angry crowd trashing Jerry's car and muttered, "It's like this every day in Puerto Rico." It was meant as a joke, but to many, it wasn't funny. It turned what could have been brushed off as accidental slapstick into something nastier, something that sounded like a racist jab. It painted Puerto Rico as a violent, chaotic place. Manuel Mirabal, head of the National Puerto Rican Coalition, said his blood boiled when he saw the flag burning, but the stereotype? That was just as bad. Bronx Borough President Fernando Ferrer said the slur about daily violence was inexcusable. For many Puerto Ricans, the scene didn't just mock their culture. It reinforced painful ideas they'd spent decades trying to dismantle. And NBC felt the heat. The backlash wasn't just loud, it was visible. Protesters gathered outside NBC's Rockefeller Center headquarters in New York. This wasn't some fringe movement. These were organized demonstrations led by respected community figures. Latino radio stations were flooded with angry callers. Ferrer's office was overwhelmed with complaints. Even though Mayor Giuliani's office reportedly got none, the pressure on NBC was real. They didn't just say sorry. They pulled the episode. NBC banned the Puerto Rican Day from syndication for 4 years. That was huge. Seinfeld was their cash cow. Reruns brought in massive advertising money. But NBC pulled it anyway. The statement they released said they didn't mean to offend anyone. But that didn't stop the bleeding. From 1998 to 2002, the episode disappeared from syndication packages. Some networks still refuse to air it to this day. The protests worked. They forced one of the most powerful networks on earth to back down. And they made it clear, jokes that cross the line, even if unintentional, can hide behind the label of comedy. But not everyone saw it that way. Jerry Seinfeld himself was frustrated. He felt like the outrage was misplaced. To him, the episode wasn't even about Puerto Ricans. It just happened to be set during a Puerto Rican parade. In fact, the writers Steve Coren and David Mandel later claimed they could have set the story during any ethnic parade in New York and nothing would have changed. But critics weren't buying it. That argument ignored the very real context of Puerto Rico's political and cultural struggles with the U.S. The choice of that parade did matter. What made Jerry even angrier was that many protesters hadn't even watched the episode. He confronted one demonstrator and asked how they could be so offended without seeing it. The answer: "We assume that it's offensive." That moment said a lot about how media outrage spread in the late 90s. No Twitter. No viral clips. Just word of mouth, radio chatter, and a title. But that was enough to set everything ablaze. Ironically, while NBC was dealing with one of its biggest controversies, it was also raking in record profits. In 1998, Seinfeld's syndication rights sold for a staggering $1.7 billion. Larry David walked away with $250 million upfront and another $40 to $50 million a year for his share. Jerry Seinfeld owned 25% too. By 2013, the show had made over $3 billion in syndication earnings. Controversy or not, people still watched. If anything, the show's dark humor and its unapologetically selfish characters made it more valuable. That idea, that being morally complicated can still be commercially brilliant, only got stronger in the streaming era. In 2019, Netflix paid over $500 million to buy Seinfeld's global streaming rights. That deal kicked in by 2021. It was 5 years long and covered all 180 episodes. To put it in perspective, NBC Universal paid $500 million for The Office, and Warner Media paid $425 million for Friends. But those were US-only deals. Netflix went worldwide. Why? Because they believed Seinfeld's humor, even the awkward, controversial bits, still resonated across cultures. Mike Hopkins of Sony Pictures Television put it bluntly: 30 years after its premiere, Seinfeld remains center stage. In other words, edgy sells, even when it offends.